Okay, I'll make a start. So good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're all well. I'm Narissa Taysom. I manage the public programme for the Foundling Museum, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this talk as part of our past and present online lunchtime talk series. Today, we are really fortunate to have Miriam Al Jamil speaking about picturing children at work and play, moral and metaphor at Vauxhall Gardens and the Foundling Hospital. It's wonderful to have Miriam back. Miriam's a regular at the Foundling Museum and part of the Women's Studies group. So hopefully some of her colleagues are out there in listening today. So just before I hand over to Miriam, a couple of notices. So just a reminder that this talk is being recorded. All of the talks in this series will appear on our YouTube channel. So if you've missed any, please do check out the Foundling Museum YouTube site. At the end of the complete series of talks, we'll be sending those recordings around to everyone who has attended. We would strongly encourage you to ask some questions throughout the talk. So please use the Q&A button and also the chat button at the bottom. I will chair the discussion with Miriam, but please do ask questions. It's great to hear from you. And now to introduce Miriam. Miriam Al Jamil is an independent researcher in art history, material culture, and women's history. She contributes art reviews and essays to online platforms, literary society, and academic journals. And her recent blog on the surprising afterlives of a portrait of Dr. Johnson can be found online at the Romantic Illustration Network. She also has a chapter in Antiquity and Enlightenment Culture, published in 2020, and 3 further forthcoming chapters in edited volumes, including in a collection entitled Pockets, Pouches, and Secret Drawers. She is the chair of the Burney Society UK, the fine arts editor for the British Society for 18th Century Studies online reviews, and is also an active member in the Johnson Society of London, and as I mentioned, the Women's Study Group 1558 to 1837. So Miriam, huge thanks for joining us today, and I will now hand over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Good, okay. So welcome to the talk. I hope it'll give you some enjoyment and food for thought over your lunchtime break. And as Narissa has said, I welcome your responses and questions at the end. You might be curious about the boy with black Cupid wings in my title image. Remember him, as he will appear later when the reason for his presence in this talk will become clear. Before we begin exploring examples of the pictures associated with the Foundling Hospital and Vauxhall Gardens, I'd like to offer 3 points which give some context for today's discussion centering on images of childhood in the 18th century. They're all simple points which at the same time are huge subjects. The first, and what might seem obvious point, is that there are dangers involved in assuming pictures tell the truth. Artists, their sitters and subjects are tied to a specific agenda and draw on the cultural traditions and artistic styles of the time. 2 influential writers are worth noting for their reliance on both pictorial representations of children and demographic statistics to inform their arguments, rather than on uncovering the actual lived experience of children. In 1962, the influential French scholar Philippe Arié published Centuries of Childhood, in which he claims that in the early modern period, there was no place for childhood. It was not treated as a separate and distinct stage of life, based largely on the fact that artists depicted children as miniature adults in smaller versions of the same dress. This idea persisted, and in 1977, the historian Lawrence Stone's influential book, The Family, Sex and Marriage in England, 1500 to 1800, also incorporated art historical evidence in a social and anthropological study of the development of family life. He claimed that there was a lack of the sense of the child as a unique being, and that only from the late 17th century, with the rise of the domesticated nuclear family, did parents become close to their children, as child mortality was so high and emotional attachment was too risky. This myth of childhood's discovery, even further on in the later 18th century, still perseveres in publications on the subject. In addition, as art historian James Stewart points out, there's a crucial difference between a social history of children and a cultural history of childhood, although the two are intricately connected. With the rise of the so-called cult of sensibility during the last half of the 18th century, the portrayal of sentiment and feeling became fashionable in the portraiture, particularly by Joshua Reynolds. The most influential texts at the time were by John Locke and later Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who emphasized the importance of a child's early years in shaping impressions and emotions, of interacting with nature and developing understanding through the senses, play, and experience. However, as Stewart notes, the cult of innocence coexisted with the increasing abuse of child labor. It might also be worth noting that Joshua Reynolds was reported to have refused to take in a baby left on his doorstep of his London home, preferring to keep sentimentality strictly to his canvases. And Rousseau was exposed in an anonymous pamphlet by his strong critic Voltaire as having insisted that his own 5 children should be sent to foundling hospitals. Though he professed his love of children, he made no comment on this and presumably perceived no contradiction. Of course, our constructs of the notion of childhood are different from those of the 18th century. And one image of a child could involve numerous different meanings. The dangers of making broad assumptions based on pictorial evidence become clear when we consider whether, based on these pictures, for example, we can actually know that the mother on the right loved her child any more than the mothers on the left. And who can really say which of the children shown here had happier childhoods? How can we know whether the girl on the right loved her dog more than the girl on the left? My second point is that the children of the poor were generally presented as generic representations rather than as individuals. They were shown as thieves and vagabonds who threatened the fundamental structures of society and required control and careful monitoring, or as figures of derision and satire, or later on in the 18th century as the sentimentalized, helpless recipients of charity. The increasing number of charities which were founded at that time and the prompting of charitable acts in didactic children's literature visualized such duties as an intrinsic part of the cult of sensibility. Beechey's painting on the left exemplifies its importance. We're shown who the charitable donors are, but the poor boy, though beautifully characterized, is anonymous. It's not necessarily clear whether the privileged children are sympathetic, afraid, curious, or indifferent about the beggar, or see reflections of themselves in his pale face, although their empathy is the theme of the painting. Sometimes artists showed wealthy children dressed in the guise of the poor as a sentimental gesture, as in the second image. We might now detect a hinted frisson in the revealing dress of the girl, but we must assume its innocence here as a gesture towards the woman she will become because her father commissioned it. And this convention remained popular well into the 19th century, when photographers such as Julia Margaret Cameron dressed her child models as beggars, or Charles Dodgson visualized Alice Liddell as the beggar maid in the Elizabethan ballad, which inspired many artists in the later 19th century. The poor had no control over how or where they were represented. They could not commission paintings or buy copies as prints. The illustrations of the children at the Foundling Hospital, which we will look at, are not portraits of individuals, but of a group defined by their status, and their appearance in a print was part of a more complex political and institutional agenda. The innocence of childhood was not the subject, but the solution to a social problem was. Only rarely was an individual child named in the case of exceptional musical talent, for example. My third point concerns what childhood actually was in the 18th and into the 19th centuries. How long did it last? How can we best define it? There is no consensus. Poor children had to work and take part in the adult world as soon as they could usefully contribute to the household, or could feed themselves if set adrift in an unforgiving urban environment. As historian Hugh Cunningham writes, childhood for the poor was seen as a time, quote, for inurement into habits of labour. And it was assumed that the children of the poor should have an economic value for their parents. On the other hand, long apprenticeships or economic dependence on patriarchal structures until the age of 21 could delay entry into the adult world. Of course, the idea of a separate and distinct teenage stage of growing up was not considered. The uncertain nature of the idea of childhood will be evident in some of the Vauxhall Gardens supper box paintings we will explore. And in some cases, the absence of children or their imagined presence in prints becomes in itself an interesting aspect to consider. Two of the earliest 18th century institutions to display art for the public to enjoy were the Foundling Hospital and Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens in the 1740s, and some of the same artists were involved and were instrumental in shaping them. This was over 20 years before the Royal Academy was founded. The purposes of these displays were very different. The first was designed to evoke sympathy for the plight of the child, and thus encourage charitable giving to support the hospital. The second provided colourful backdrops, while patrons entertained their guests in their supper boxes, and these celebrated the heedless and impulsive vigour of youth, sensuous abandonment, and the risks of play, which the public associated with the gardens. Both organisations were popular subjects for printmakers. There are many views of the Foundling in prints, made during its construction and after it opened, to celebrate its worthy cause and reassure the public of its merit by the sheer monumentality of its bulk and symmetry, aligning it with traditional architectural representations of other institutions. These views did not generally feature the children who were resident there. There are a variety of versions of this coloured engraving, each incorporating different numbers of figures. Here, a few children stroll with adults, both inside the grounds and outside the gates, added to give a sense of scale. But the well-dressed visitors and carriages bowling along the drive reflect the tradition of country estate paintings, such as those of the Dutch painter Jan Sieberek, popular from the late 17th century. These perspective views exaggerate the scale and visualize the buildings within their landscapes as harmonious and idyllic extensions of the natural world. They incorporated a political agenda of entitlement and order. The Foundling, depicted using such continental conventions, is a place of taste and elegance, a place for promenading, being seen, and displaying one's moral and civic virtue through charitable patronage. The building was a significant work of civic architecture, and plans utilised the same formal conventions of architectural elevations as other public and private schemes. Engravings soon represented the hospital as a destination for sightseeing and afternoon strolls, for shady and picturesque views and tranquil enjoyment. Here, the gates are not shown and the children are out of sight. As the map shows, it was during its early days on the edge of the countryside, and the movement of foundling babies out to rural wet nurses and back when they had been weaned formed an intricate connection between the two. The increase in size and extent of North London villages in the background can be seen in later prints of the hospital. However, the gates loom large in most of the early prints, marking the separation from the outside world. Here, the barrier is not the one protecting property and aristocratic rights of ownership, but one marking the status of the institution and the dependence of its inmates removed from the city beyond and subject to prescribed rules. Here, a small group in the foreground of a different view of the foundling shows mothers with babies who we assume are shortly to be candidates for admission, possibly in discussion with Thomas Coram himself, the steadfast philanthropist whose efforts resulted in the founding of the hospital, which admitted the first children in 1741. Also seen on this slide is a sampler depicting the familiar scene in prints of the hospital, and we might like to come back to this later. Two of Samuel Wales' prints, however, employ emblematic figures in an elaborate visual account of the founding principles of the hospital. The first contrasts the reign of the fickle goddess Fortune, whose wheel has spun for the unfortunate group of women queuing at the gates, hoping to secure for their babies a better life than they could offer. The figure of Charity within the gates presides with benevolence over the lives of the children once admitted. They had little hope of charitable understanding in the city beyond its perimeter walls. The second of Wales' prints substitutes Fortune for Venus outside the gates, round which 5 children dance. In the courtyard, Diana of Ephesus is a nurturing presence. Venus, of course, has many different manifestations. She is the goddess of generation, fertility, and the benign female principle as opposed to male strength. She is associated with both vice and virtue. So I would suggest that the dancing children who celebrate the life force of Venus might have conjured up for an 18th century viewer their own judgments about the foundlings' mothers, driven by necessity to give up their babies, as well as the intended message about the grateful children cared for by the institution as a substitute mother. Further ambiguity arises from the clothes worn by the children here. Distinctive uniforms identified charity school children, such as those of the Bluecoat schools. They were described as a kind of livery and distinguished the children from others. Patrons could therefore always keep an eye on their behaviour. The foundling uniform in brown serge further distinguished the foundlings from other charity school children. Uniforms declared the practical efforts of the organisation and regulated the appearance of the children for the public, but this provision was also intended to ingrain principles of industry and economy. A 1771 minute record at the Foundling stated, "The committee observing that many stockings were bought for the use of the girls, ordered that the girls do in the future knit their own or do without." With the regulation uniform of the Foundling in mind, it's interesting to look at a hand-coloured copy of Wales' second print, which inadvertently alters its specific allegory. Hand colouring was a task usually carried out at printmakers by apprentices and low-paid workers who used the colours provided and who were not expected to interpret or reinforce the purpose of the prints piled up on their work tables. Do we assume that the colourful dancing children represent children in general, votives at the shrine of Venus, celebrating her life-giving power? Or should they represent the children saved by the foundling, whose brown uniform would identify them? How does this subtly alter the message? I haven't found a print showing foundling children dancing or playing, probably with good reason. They were not saved in order to live the carefree life of the average child and could not be represented as doing so. Hogarth's engraving served as a headpiece on a power of attorney for the new hospital's subscription collection and follows the conventions of sequential narrative art, tracing in one image the story of the abandoned child seen on the far left, its rescue by Coram, and the subsequent lives open to it as a useful member of the British workforce. A child left to die was a wasted asset for the country. The foundling could justify its value for the economy by providing domestic and agricultural labourers and naval recruits to serve an expanding military and mercantile nation. The Foundling Museum recently acquired a campaign medal belonging to a former foundling boy who served under Nelson on HMS Victory. A group of children in the print face the sea where ships await them, one holding up a cross formed of 3 horizontal bars representing the Trinity. Civic and religious duty is therefore fulfilled. The children in this print issue from the hospital with its British coat of arms above the door to take up their place as useful members of society to contribute to its comfort, wealth, and prosperity. Hogarth's design for the foundling's coat of arms incorporated an abandoned child similar to that in his subscription engraving, flanked by Britannia and the Diana of Ephesus, which Whale pictured in the courtyard of the building. The foundling child was in the complicated position of having a natural mother, but no father, and a surrogate mother in the form of the hospital. Connecting these elements to form a comprehensible visual iconography was important if the hospital's charitable mission could be successfully promoted. The vertical axes emphasize the Christian ideal of charity, and the horizontal axes connect nature and Britannia, or the biological parent and the state. Iconography, which as Anya Muller summarizes in her discussion, presents the foundling at the intersection of the major discourses that create a frame for the foundling, discourses on the family, as well as on charity, religion, and politics. So both civic and religious duty was expected of charity children. As early as 1703, it was suggested that London charity school children should process through the streets to a church and hear a sermon. Within 2 years, the numbers involved in this rite doubled to 4,000. The children became spectacle at the service of fundraising, and the sermons were addressed to the assembled parishioners with the children as their subject, rather than to the children directly. This print, reissued from an original of 1715, shows a public procession of members of Parliament in their carriages through London to mark the Peace of Utrecht and the end of the War of the Spanish Succession. 4,000 charity school children, new clothed for the occasion, sat in ranks on specially made tiered platforms, singing hymns, the same ones repeated over again during the 3-hour-long event. At the top of the print, a portrait of Queen Anne on the left is accompanied by Britannia on the right, presiding over ships and men ploughing and sowing seeds. Britannia rules both the waves of the sea and the furrows of the land, and both these symbols of national pride and wealth were clearly referenced by Hogarth in his subscription print that we saw. Charity children were one of the vehicles by which the nation could embody its virtue and aspire to future economic and military success, participants in Britannia's wider scheme. This 1820 pamphlet was intended to be given to foundlings as they left and began their new life as useful members of society. It reminds them to be grateful that they had been saved and to repay the efforts of the hospital by leading good and virtuous lives. If they had not been taken in, they would have lived in ignorance and beggary, or more probably have perished in your infancy. Allegorical figures of faith, hope, and charity head the sheet, based on well-known illustrative models. The anchor was an emblem associated with hope, as well as with Britannia, representing stability and safety, a further potent reminder of the work of the foundling and its impact on the lives of its children. Popular prints of the Foundling Chapel, in a similar way, emphasize the centrality of religious faith as a connection between the children and their benefactors. The children share the service with the donors and contributing members of the public, on display to attest to their religious obligations and conformity. I'm sure many of you will have seen the elaborate courtroom reinstated at the Foundling Museum and will have seen the paintings which William Hogarth, Francis Hayman and others donated to the hospital, in part to solicit funds for the institution and in part to show their own work and achieve public recognition. The biblical narrative of charity reinforced the hospital's founding mission. Hayman's version of the Finding of Moses imagines the Pharaoh's daughter as the charitable institution itself and foregrounds Moses' mother's scheme to offer her service as wet nurse. Hogarth's more controversial version of the return of Moses to the Pharaoh's daughter includes the payment of the mother for her work, which mirrors the practices of the hospital itself. The complex dynamics between the figures in the paintings are open to interpretation, as the attendants whisper their suspicions to each other, and the reluctance of the child to leave his nurse introduces pathos to the question of how vulnerable orphans were treated. But fashionable visitors to the hospital would understand the religious imperative for charity, which the courtroom paintings spelled out. However, I will not dwell on the courtroom paintings here. They are an interesting and well-documented subject. Instead, I will move on to the second institution with which this talk is concerned, and its quite different representations of children. This print shows the pleasure gardens, which were developed by entrepreneur Jonathan Tyers. He was originally from a family of specialist fellmongers, and that was part of the leather trade, in Bermondsey, South London. But he was able to reinvent himself, as David Koch and Alan Borg discuss in their comprehensive book on the history of Vauxhall Gardens. He made a great success of his site for pleasure and sociability, bought originally in 1729, but in its heyday of popularity in the 1740s. This print utilizes the bird's eye view, which we saw earlier, and gives an idea of its several acres of walks and buildings, which continued as an entertainment venue until they closed permanently in 1859, which interestingly, that was 3 years after the first music hall officially opened in London. An intriguing and seemingly random connection between Vauxhall and the Foundling can be found in the copper season ticket shown here. The tickets featured a different subject each year, usually drawn from stories of classical gods and muses, and the subscriber's name was added to the reverse. Up to 1,000 season tickets in gold, silver, or copper might have been sold in 1 year, with daily entrance for other users charged at £1. This example references the story of Arion, the singer-poet, who was thrown into the sea by sailors and rescued by a dolphin sent by Jupiter, which carried him to Corinth. It's told by Ovid in his poem, The Fasti. Arion represents pleasure, song, and celebration, an apt connection with the gardens. This ticket is now at the Foundling Museum and joins the large collection of different types of tokens which were left with the children who were admitted, as a form of identification in case the mothers had the wherewithal to reclaim them in the future. Needless to say, few were able to do this. Only 152 children of the 16,282 admitted between 1741 and 1760 saw their mothers again. This token conjures up the possibility that the mother who left it with her child was a habitué of the gardens. Many sex workers plied their trade there in spite of official efforts to discourage them, or else she had a wealthy lover or was an opportunistic thief. The Foundling had to negotiate the perilous ground between charitable aid for the deserving poor and the contemporary perception of the morally compromised, undeserving poor, a category within which most of the mothers who brought their children were inevitably located. Vauxhall Gardens was one of many sites in London where surreptitious liaisons could take place. And indeed, respectable women could be at risk in the dark side alleys and jostling in the anonymous crowds. Vauxhall and other pleasure gardens, of course, provided a useful setting in novels, from Francis Burney's 1778 Evelina and William Thackeray's 1847 Vanity Fair, to Laura Shepherd Robinson's 2020 murder mystery, Daughters of Night, and continues to inspire popular culture, such as in the Bridgerton series. It's here where I wish to turn to the picture which you saw briefly in my title slide. This is Joshua Reynolds' painting, Cupid as a Link Boy, which together with its companion, Mercury as a cut purse, was bought by an admirer of Reynolds' so-called fancy pictures, the third Duke of Dorset, and hung in his dedicated Reynolds room at Knoll in Kent. The word link was a term used to describe the flax or hemp tow, spelt T-O-W, or fibre, which formed the wick of the torch, as well as perhaps the now more familiar term tow rope. I don't know, perhaps. Although link just also conveniently describes the boy's work. Such pictures of the poor anonymous child model could be appreciated for their clear erotic content. Andrew O'Malley suggests it's difficult to conclude whether Reynolds wished to elicit sympathy for the link boy, as he has, quote, the jagged tar black wings of the demon rather than the pristine white feathers of an angel. Although the children depicted in the fancy pictures still appear pitiful. The dilemma over what attitude to take over these children is evident in contemporary writing. In the 18th century, invoking the idea of innocence was often associated with imminent corruption. As a 1761 London Guide noted in its mention of poor children in the city, quote, necessity makes them prostitutes, even before their passions can have any share in their guilt. Among these unhappy objects, very agreeable features are frequently seen amidst dirt and rags, and this exposes them to greater hazards. The assumptions behind the terms passions and guilt to describe the behaviour of children in this passage may, of course, give us pause for thought in the light of our own contemporary understanding of grooming, abuse, and child labour. The link boy was a common sight in many major cities throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and no doubt lingered outside the gates of Vauxhall Gardens to tout for business, lighting the way for sedan chairs along the dark roads. Link boys appear in a surprising number of satirical prints as comic, unsympathetic figures associated with the nighttime economy, as here guiding the exhausted reveller home when the morning trade has already begun. This link boy is actually unusually known. He was Lawrence Casey, who worked for the courtesan Betty Careless, the woman in the chair. Cruikshank's satire on foggy weather depicts a group of link boys of different ages managing a set of hazards typical of their work. And Hogarth included one in his image of night, seen on the right. Most appear older than Reynolds' young boy, and details of this 1821 print highlight the struggle for business, which must have been common between those waiting for clients. They were frequently characterized as collaborators and go-betweens in the London sex trade, and by association as knowing participants. Reynolds' link boy, like the season ticket we have seen, serves as a link too between the women at the gates of the Foundling and the circumstances which might have led to their harrowing decision to give up their babies. It's perhaps not surprising, in the light of the popular reputation which Vauxhall Gardens sought to counter, that many of the paintings and prints include children as strollers with groups of adults in the grounds, or peeping out from behind a tree, as in Canaletto's painting. We can also glimpse the supper box paintings here, which will be the subject of our final discussion. The polite crowd, fashionably dressed and engaged in conversation, represent the clientele to which Jonathan Tyers aspired. They reinforced his own claim to gentility and elevated the status of the gardens. The promenading families imply shared values of order and stability. Both fathers and mothers are present with their children. The inclusion of the children projects decency and morality and hints at the aspiration of the gardens to retain the custom of the next generation. This aspect of the prints, therefore, has much in common with the prints of the Foundling we've examined. The strolling figures are similar in representing a desired, refined clientele. There are no beggars or disruptive forces in Canaletto's paintings. None of the children shown here have been abandoned. The link boys are outside the gate, unseen, as indeed are other workers, both child and adult, such as catering staff. But these paintings of the gardens cannot be taken as the whole truth. The gardens were open for evening entertainment for an adult clientele, so small children would be unlikely visitors. Hogarth offered his services and those of his students and colleagues at the St. Martin's Lane Academy to decorate the supper boxes, which were a prominent feature of the gardens. In the light of this collaboration, Koch and Borg, in their book, characterised Tyers as nothing less than one of the great patrons of contemporary British art. By 1750, there were over 130 boxes, rising to 140 by 1800. So this means of displaying their paintings in public was an unprecedented opportunity for the artists involved. The paintings measured about 8 by 5 feet, were set at the back of each supper box, where they were possibly kept on rollers and ceremonially uncovered each evening. Over the years, of course, they suffered damage, had to be regularly repaired and retouched, so it's perhaps surprising that any survived at all. The V&A and the Tate have 7 by Heyman, and around the same number are in other collections, but many of his paintings are only known through sketches. The range of subject matter was broad and celebrated different aspects of British rural and urban life, along with themes from Shakespeare and scenes of marine battles, for example. Here, I will focus on a few of the paintings which included children as their subjects and explore their inspiration and social and cultural references in the context of our discussion so far. Firstly, where could Heyman and his fellow artists find ideas for their depictions of children, which could easily be recognised and appreciated by the Vauxhall crowds? I suggest that important sources were the illustrated books for children, which formed a burgeoning market during the second half of the 18th century, in response to the idea that instruction was more entertaining and therefore more effective if accompanied by pictures. Locke had early on advised values of the necessity of warning children against vice. But these books emphasized rising middle-class values of virtue, temperance, and hard work in a familial setting, and included illustrations of games and pastimes, which were generally clearly imagined in gendered terms. The first publisher to see potential in the market for children's books was John Newbury. And the publication of his Little Pretty Pocket Book of 1744 coincided with the heyday of Vauxhall Gardens. It seems it included an innovative toy giveaway, and its moral lesson is clear in the title: a ball and pincushion, the use of which will infallibly make Tommy a good boy and Polly a good girl. The introduction to parents follows Locke's idea and suggests that the key to happiness is, quote, to subdue, therefore, your children's passions, curb their tempers and make them subservient to the rules of reason. A very Enlightenment-focused message. Crucially, Newbury connected the rules of a game to the rules of life. They're singled out on each page in case the reader has missed them, although the moral seems only generally relevant to the image. The pages shown here reflect subjects also chosen for supper box paintings, the Kite and May Day celebrations. Interestingly, the metaphor of kite flying does not now carry the meaning which was invariably attached to it in the 18th century. Now it refers to a form of testing the waters for responses to an idea. Then it suggested the fickleness of fortune, human pride and vulnerability, disappointed hopes, and aspiring above your station. Heyman's sketch shows a group of boys collaborating in flying their kite. The making and flying of kites is usually an activity for boys, independent of adult supervision, and appears in numerous illustrations in a rural and urban setting. Hogarth included a fallen kite in his series, The Four Times of Day, in the plate Noon, which shows fashionable Huguenots leaving their French church in Hog Lane, St. Giles. They're contrasted with the chaotic group of English people on the right. The metaphor of the kite in the poem shown here describes the kite's pride in believing it can be free of its strings and soar into the clouds, and its resulting fall. It's possible this explains the frame of Hogarth's reference. The two verses of the poem on the subject spell out the moral of the tale. That's the last two verses. My heart replied, "O Lord, I see how much this kite resembles me. Forgetful that by thee I stand, impatient of thy ruling hand, how oft I've wished to break the lines thy wisdom for my lot assigns. How oft indulged a vain desire for something more or something higher, and but for grace or love divine, a fall thus dreadful had been mine." Is Hogarth making a point about the pride and misguided religious faith of those exiting the chapel? Such a moral would have provided entertaining discussion for Vauxhall guests. This inclusion of kites in 18th century portraits and conversation pieces is very common, usually accompanying small boys who proudly show their practical skills and handiwork in a completed kite. The second supper box painting, which I will consider, is this surviving example, which you can view in the V&A British Galleries. May Day, of course, was a traditional day of celebration, and the poem on the right appeared with a printed reproduction of this painting. It's a typical commemoration of the season. But rather than a rustic entertainment, this picture relates to a London event, such as would be familiar to Vauxhall's clients. Here are images of the occasion in London streets, along with spectators and the various characters who accompanied the milkmaids on their parade, such as Jack in the Green. Milkmaids brought fresh milk from surrounding countryside to sell at the doors of city dwellers. One example of the numerous sellers who plied their trades in the city streets, featured in various Cries of London print series. The traditional pile of silverware, which the milkmaids carried on their heads for the May Day parade, interestingly, was reputed to have been lent by pawnbrokers at an hourly rate, a very urban aspect of the day. A detail of these three depictions of May Day, on which I wish to focus, however, is not the milkmaid, but the shadowy figures on the left of the Vauxhall painting, who appear as cavorting and dancing participants at in the other two prints. They are child chimney sweeps or climbing boys who featured increasingly at the centre of urban May Day festivities from the 18th century. It was the one day a year when they were not working. Heyman presents them on the margins of the action with the brushes and shovels of their trades, one of them beating his shovel to accompany the milkmaid's dance. They are an example of working children who thus made an appearance in Vauxhall Gardens, albeit on canvas. They're depicted unsentimentally but without judgment, at a time when they barely registered in the public consciousness as children at all, but were seen as villains ripening for the gallows. In the 18th century, younger and younger children were required by the chimney sweep trade because the chimney width of narrow city houses was often a matter of inches, which only a young child could squeeze into. They often became stuck and asphyxiated. Women, as well as men, employed them. The climbing boys were part of city life. One appears among the crowd in Hogarth's painting, The March to Finchley, which is on show at the Foundling Museum and may be familiar to you. You can just see him on the right. This anonymous print both satirises the sweep as a grotesque member of the lower classes and the woman painter who is incapable of transforming the boy into a representation of mankind. Women artists were presumed to be incapable of interpreting the general principles fundamental to great art. So this is a complex satire. Prints of working children, child sweeps in particular, did not portray the child that existed beneath his ingrained layers of soot. The most frequent appearances of child chimney sweeps in satirical prints is as sturdy and bold ruffians as on the right, and as observers in the streets as here on the left. They point out comical and absurd characters and invite the viewer to laugh. They join the mayhem and mockery of popular culture as part of its unforgiving enjoyment of other people's discomfort and misfortune. They're often paired with the milkmaid, as we saw in previous prints, and here again in Paul Sandby's attack on Hogarth on the left, and in the raillery on the right while a beating is taking place. The milkmaid and the sweep represent opposites joined through an itinerant and vulnerable way of life in the city. The white of the milk and the black of the soot, male and female, the country and the town. Not until Blake featured the plight of the chimney sweep in his Songs of Innocence and Experience was any real emotional empathy expressed for the child, described by Blake as a little black thing among the snow. And in the Songs of Experience, and wearing the clothes of death, the child's parents collude with church and state to resign him to misery. But however, in keeping with the impulse towards charity as part of the new sensibility during the last part of the century, which we mentioned earlier, some effort was made to alleviate the plight of the child sweeps. In 1785, Jonas Hanway saw the only solution as the invention of some mechanical means of cleaning chimneys, which indeed did eventually render their work unnecessary. But it was 1875 before a bill was pushed through Parliament to prevent the use of children as chimney sweeps. The supper box paintings included many renditions of the idea of risk, both physical and moral. Here, sliding on the ice has parallels in Dutch paintings depicting similar scenes, often incorporating moral maxims. The final painting, which I'll mention, is Heyman's Seesaw. The children, in inverted commas, involved in a childhood activity more correctly represent teenagers engaged in a hazardous game which poses both physical and moral risk for those involved. We might see similar risks in the well-known Fragonard painting, The Swing, on the right. Happy Accidents of the Swing, the French title of the painting, is more explicit in its description. The young men in both paintings take advantage of the abandonment of decorum by the young women. But of course, not every artistic depiction of the seesaw took this moral stance. So, in conclusion, Heyman's paintings reflected the undercurrent of risk at Vauxhall Gardens, which we have seen earlier, and were designed to provoke, entertain, and surprise their viewers. The frivolous and playful, with their underlying risks and consequences, along with references to the darker side of childhood labour, render his subjects for Vauxhall Gardens fascinating and unique as public art in the 18th century. Though the artistic project on display there and the illustrations for the Foundling seem quite different at first sight, their connections can be explored through the social conditions, entrepreneurial spirit, and institutional policies that shape them. And I'm just ending here with a few of the titles which I have found useful, some of them I've quoted, and which you might wish to reference to explore the subject further. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Miriam. What a fascinating talk and subject, and so many images and literary references there, which I'm sure many of us will want to delve back into. I wonder whether we could share that list of that resource list at the end with anyone who's interested. Perhaps we could email it around to everyone. But huge thanks. That was absolutely fascinating. We only have a few minutes, but do we have any questions? Thank you, Francesca. Great talk. Have we got any questions from anyone listening today? Just wait one more moment.
Is that okay? I'll put the last slide on again.
That would be great. Yeah, if you could share that with us.
Can you see it?
We can't. If you just click share screen again.
Oh, okay.
That would be fantastic. But we can always email it around, Miriam, so don't worry too much.
Okay.
It looks like we don't have any questions. Often with these talks, we find that people go away and then send us questions afterwards. So if that is the case for anyone, please do just email me your questions. Ah, great. Thank you. We can now see that list there. And Miriam, tell me, is this, are you taking this research any further?
Well, it sort of stems out of research that I did some years ago. It certainly would be interesting to take it further. I mean, now sort of having different perspectives on this thing after some years. For instance, the sampler, which I showed earlier, I think is it on display now at the museum? I think it might be.
I actually don't think it is at the moment, but we do have it on our online collections.
Oh, okay. Because that I find fascinating. It was supposed to have been, so it was made in 1825. Well, that's the date on it, but it depicts a much earlier print. And as a depiction by a child of an institution like that, I think that deserves quite a bit of study. The fact that she has, apparently she was baptized nearby in the local parish, but wasn't necessarily a foundling herself, which I had assumed when I first saw it. But, why did she choose to make this depiction of the foundling as her subject? I mean, a sampler would take, well, weeks, if not months of work to do. So I'd love to know what her connection was. And what interests me is the fact that she has taken the people and coaches depicted in the grounds and flattened them out and made them in the centre quite a central part of her work. So she's sort of taken on board the whole idea of the institution as a place of discernment and taste, I'd love to know more about her. So I don't know, maybe that would be some research worth doing for, dig a bit deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, there's a question here from Joanne following on from that. Can you talk a little bit about the perspective of the whole institution from above, sort of not having any human point of view?
So the idea of the bird's eye view.
Bird's eye view, exactly.
I think that was, it was a very well-known tradition of architectural views. There are bird's eye views, for instance, of Hampton Court, mostly palatial and noble piles that were depicted in this way. I mean, they were probably quite expensive to commission, but just the fact that that we have something similar with the Foundling, I think in itself shows part of the institutional need to show themselves in relation to the nobility, to worthy institutions, national institutions, and just that in itself alone, apart from the other views of the Foundling, shows the aspirations that they had. And of course, it was important to emphasize this because as any of you who know much about the beginning of the Foundling Hospital, they had to counter a lot of criticism that that the hospital was simply taking in the unwanted babies of noblemen, who've impregnated their maids or their mistresses, and they're going to just leave them there at the expense to bring them up of the general public. So, I mean, this was the fundamental problem of the Foundling Hospital, as opposed to other sort of charitable institutions for children. And it took quite a lot of work to counter that. And I'm sure this is why the emphasis in the prints is really on the institution as a worthy place, as a national asset that deserved charitable giving. It took them a long time to counter that. And of course, that was also linked with how they had to depict the children. And there had to be absolutely no question about what the children were destined for and how they were going to benefit the nation. I think it was all linked, and the physical depiction of the institution itself had to be linked to that national concern with, what was worthy and, an asset to the country. Anyway.
Thank you. Yeah, that's so fascinating, that sort of intersection of architecture, of public profile. I think even your discussion about uniform, is integral to that as well, about public perception. So yeah, thank you. That's really fascinating. And we just have time for a question here from Karen, who has asked, she says she wonders if there are any measures of how well the paintings in the Foundling were effective for encouraging charity towards these children. And thank you for a great talk.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Yes, sorry. Were any of these paintings, how effective were they in encouraging charitable donations to the Foundling?
Well, very effective, I think. There are other. Recently there was an exhibition at the Foundling a few years ago of particularly the noble women whose efforts were encouraged to get all the noble women involved, and they themselves benefited because they were shown as being charitable to poor lost children. It was a huge effort amongst noble benefactors and donors, and they were really responsible, and the women, noble women particularly, were very fundamental in gaining funds for the children. So I think they were very successful, and it stayed, of course. we get into the 19th century, there are photographs by that stage of the children who are very well organized. It seems to be just a real national institution, and of course still going, which is wonderful. I mean, and now the museum is promoting everything to do with it, and has preserved the buildings, parts of the building and the art and so on. So it seems to be ongoing, really. And then of course the Quorum Foundation, it just sort of seems to carry on. Yes, I'm not an expert on the actual history, the detailed history of the place, but yes,
I think you summarized it perfectly. Yeah, we are absolutely continuing what started 300 years ago, and the basis of our collection is now what is available to view for the public. So thank you so much for drawing that all together in such a brilliant way. And of course, if you are local, please do come and visit the Foundling Museum. It's a wonderful place, and we also continue that legacy today, working with contemporary artists whose work supports our work to help those with care experience. So the sort of legacies that you talk about continue today. Thank you, Miriam, for a brilliant talk today. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Just a reminder that our next talk is on the 13th of July. That's Charles Jennings, the man behind Handel's Messiah. So something slightly different for you. And we will be joined by a Jennings expert, Ruth Smith, who will be talking about Handel and Jennings at the Foundling Museum. So thank you so much, and thank you again, Miriam, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you very much.